Welcome back to Make Stuff Nation. In today's episode of building a plywood snipe class sailboat, we're going to work on the seats or quarterdecks as well as doing the final installation on the daggerboard case. Let's get started. The book Building a Plywood Snipe gives us a diagram of the frames we're going to need to build for the seats or quarterdecks. We need to make a minimum of 4 frames for each side, so a total of 8. And rather than having to draw these dimensions out on each piece of wood for the frame, it's going to be easier to make a template. So I took those dimensions and went into Fusion 360 and drew a full-size plan. I then had it printed out at full scale on 11 by 17 paper at a UPS store, and I can cut these out and use them as a template. I've got a piece of plywood slightly bigger than the template. I'm going to use spray adhesive to glue this template onto the plywood, and then I'll cut it out with a bandsaw and sand it down to the line to give myself a wooden template that I can use with a router pattern bit to cut out these frames. I have 2 pieces of 3/4 inch cypress left over from the other deck beams. I'm going to use this to cut out the frames for the seats. I should be able to get almost all of them out of one board. As I said, I need a minimum of 8, but I'm probably going to cut 10 or 12 just to have a few extra. There's a total of 10 frames. I routed these quarterdeck beams or seat supports down to their final dimensions by tacking our pattern on with some carpet tacks and then using a pattern cutting bit or flush trim bit on my router table to cut them to final shape. Now we can move on to installing the seats. I'll be using 4 deck beams or seat supports on each side, and I've got 4 extras just in case I mess up and cut something wrong or break one. I've gone ahead and fit the quarterdeck or seats on the port side to figure out my installation process. I haven't permanently installed it in place because I'll do that once I get the other side complete. I'll be installing 1 quarterdeck beam on the fore side of the aft deck frame, 1 at station 4, 1 at station 3, and 1 on the aft face of the foredeck beam. I also built this piece of cypress. This is 3/4 inch by 1 3/4 inch, and that's going to make the front of the seat rail or the quarterdeck. To put this first quarterdeck beam in position, I made sure the boat itself is level, and then I'm going to line up this deck beam so that the projection of the top of the deck beam is going to intersect the shear line of the boat. I also made this jig or template that can assist me in seeing where that's going to happen. So that's approximately the right height. Now I'm going to use this short level to level the bottom straight edge of the deck beam to be level with the rest of the boat. That looks good. Now I'll check the shear line again. Solid. I'm going to clamp it in place. With it clamped in place, now I can get the bevel marked for this edge. I'll set my bevel gauge even with the flat bottom of the frame, the other edge with the shear of the boat. Tighten it up. Check it to make sure it didn't move. That looks good. Now I can unclamp this deck beam. Now I can move my bevel gauge so that the edge is lined up with this corner. Make sure this is flush against the bottom, and then use a pen, pencil, marking knife, whatever you want to mark this bevel. Now I need to mark the bevel for the other direction of the frame. To do that, again I'll use my bevel gauge, put it against the shear of the boat or the shear clamp, the other side against this deck beam, and tighten it. Now I can transfer that bevel onto my deck beam. You can flip your bevel gauge around however you need to get it lined up. You just have to make sure you have the correct orientation for the angle. You can always put the deck beam back where it was to make sure those angles look right. I'm also going to put this angle from the shear up at this end because the inside of this deck is going to be curved to match the curvature of the boat. So again, I set my bevel gauge up using that same angle with the corner. Draw my line. I'm also going to mark it on the other side. That's going to make it easier to see. And now we're ready to trim this. And now I can move on to the next one. I'm going to cut these out all at the same time. Roughly line it up in place. Check for where it's going to intersect the shear line. temporarily clamp it. Now check for level. That looks good. Now, with this clamp in the way, I need to figure out a different way to measure this bevel. Since the bottom of this is level, one thing I can do, don't even really have to clamp this in place. I can use this as a spacer, set my bevel gauge even against the shear of the boat. If I don't use this as a spacer, my bevel gauge hits or stands off this frame and isn't quite straight. Now I can go ahead and mark that bevel on this frame just like the other. With that, now I can come and get this bevel. Now that I have all the bevels marked out on each deck beam, I can take it over the disc sander and sand them down to the line. With the frame beveled, now I can go ahead and fix it in place. Again, I'll use this jig to set it even with the shear line, then get the bottom level. That looks good, so now I'll clamp it in place and I use a couple screws to attach it. With all these quarterdeck beams installed, now I can go ahead and add some diagonal supports under the two unsupported quarterdeck beams. With all these quarterdeck beams and supports fit, I can now take them all out and then epoxy them in place in final position. Once the epoxy is cured, I'll go ahead and fit and install the rails or longitudinal members along the quarterdecks. Part of epoxying the seats or quarterdecks in place is going to involve epoxying this last deck beam from the foredeck in place. I can't do that though until I have the daggerboard case completely fit and installed. To do that, I need to permanently attach the support strut to the daggerboard case. I need to drill and attach the keel bolts that hold the daggerboard case down to the keel. And then I also need to flush trim the daggerboard slot in the keel with the daggerboard case slot. Once I have that done, I can epoxy the daggerboard case in place. Now I can go ahead and mark out where the keel bolts are going to be. Now that the epoxy is cured on the quarterdeck support structure, I can go ahead and install the longitudinal members. It's going to be the same 3/4 by 1.5 inch stock we've used on the rest of the boat. I've cut this piece to approximate length. Now I'm going to cut the bevel on one end, measure the actual length, and cut the bevel on the other end. All right, let's test this fit. Yeah, that'll be a nice tight fit. Now we can go ahead and epoxy and screw it in place. So what I'm going to do, now that I have it roughly in place, I'm going to put a screw in either end. Then I'm going to use some clamps to move this down into position and screw and clamp this in place. I put a spacer block here, and I'm using a board with a clamp to put pressure on this rail so I can move it down into position. I want the bottom of the rail even with the bottom of the quarterdeck beam. Alright, the single clamp there seems to be holding this one at the correct position, which is good because that means it'll be a nice fair curve. Well, as you just saw, after the epoxy cured on the quarterdecks, I went ahead and started beveling in the shear of the boat with the arc of the deckwork. I've completed that bevel all the way up to frame 1, where I'm going to leave the frame extensions on for now to again help support and secure the boat while I continue working on the inside. I've got a whole list of things I need to finish before I can actually put the decks on. First, I need to make the fore and aft bulkheads at frame 2 and frame 5 to waterproof those sections of the boat for positive buoyancy in case of capsize. Then I need to radius all these edges on the inside of the cockpit that could cut you or scrape you when you're actually sailing the boat. You want to make sure it's nice and smooth and comfortable for your ride. Then I also need to angle the top edge of the chine block because right now it angles up and in and could trap water. You want to make sure it's at least parallel to the water line, if not angled down and in, so it'll shed water and make the boat easier to bail and also prevent it from trapping water and causing rot. Also, before I add the deck work on top, I need to install the chain plates up here at the front of the boat to support the mast stays. I just received the hardware for that in the mail, so I can go ahead and make some blocking and get those installed. Once I get all that work done, I can go ahead and sand, prime, and paint the inside of the boat. It's going to be much easier to do that without the decks actually on the boat, so you can get into all these corners and spaces easily. Well, that's where I'm going to wrap up today's video. I hope you found it entertaining and useful. Thanks again for watching Make Stuff Nation. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.